this place find yourself a friend. Lay down your defenses and fears. You're welcome here. Yes, you're welcome here. Yes, you're welcome here.
We're going to try this with audio. Thank you, everybody, for waiting for me on all that. I'm Reverend Dave Thompson. I'm really excited to bring you back to our Civil Human Bible study. Today, we're talking about the End Times series. This is what I'm going to be addressing over next period of the next few days. I'm pretty excited about it because it's sort of a communication and an idea in our society of this almost magical ending of the world, and it involves this Antichrist, and it involves what is oftentimes portrayed as myth, or in Christian vernacular, absolute truth of what's going to be happening at the end of the world. And it's kind of been popularized in culture. And so I want to walk through what Jesus actually says, and when he's talking about this, what he means, and separate a little bit of the myth and the fiction from actually what was said in the documents in these 2,000-year-old texts. So as a civil human minister, which is what I am, I'm trying to look at my own spiritual heritage to try to find those things that I feel are applicable to all humans across the board, you know, regardless of our different faiths, our different ways of perceiving politics, and our different lifestyles. So let's go ahead and jump into the text today. It's Matthew chapter 24, verses 3 through 8. Starting in verse 3. Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of all the age?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in various places. All these things are the beginnings of sorrows." What actually translates as birth pangs in the original text at the very end there. So what's going on right now, and what is Jesus talking about? This is going to be really important for us, especially as we're looking at how to interpret this, because these particular verses, especially in my own spiritual heritage, have been interpreted in some of the most wild ways possible, and even created these movies that we had to watch even at like church as youth. We watched a movie called A Distant Thunder, I think. If you can find, I think it's like on YouTube. You might check it out. Maybe I'll try to put a link in the show notes so that everybody can look at it. It's an interesting take on the interpretation of what Jesus is saying here. A bit dramatic, and yeah, a bit, well, I'd say Hollywood, except that it's really kind of cheesy and super 70s-ish. So everybody's in, the bell bottoms, because I think it was created in the 70s. So it's kind of a kick to watch the culture back then and the way that they portrayed this idea of the rapture and all of these end time things. So I would encourage you to look at it. It will actually give you a good perspective of how many evangelical Christians in particular might perceive or think about the end times. It'll give you a good insight into that culture. So let's go ahead and walk through this verse. And I want to set it up first by explaining that Jesus right now has left the temple. Just before this, we went through a series where Jesus is rebuking the leadership, the religious leadership of his day. He's sitting in the temple. They came after him. He came after them. It was, huge controversy, and the money changers and the commerce in the temple was thrown about. Jesus throwing people out of the temple and making all kinds of ruckus. And now he's left. And yesterday we talked about the fact that his disciples, as they were leaving, were pointing out how beautiful this temple was and all this grandioseness that the Pharisees and the religious leaders had created. And Jesus says, do you see all of this here? Not one stone will stand upon the other. And Jesus was just basically giving the reality that this kind of leadership, and we talked about this yesterday, when leadership doesn't have its vision anymore, when it loses its principles, it can no longer stand and it will eventually fall. It's just really a truism of humanity. But in particular, it was speaking about the year 70 CE or AD, as it used to be said, when the Romans came and took over Jerusalem and basically desolated the entire temple. So now the disciples have gathered around him. We're on the Mount of Olives, which is like a small hill in Jerusalem. Jerusalem doesn't have massive mountains. Like, I grew up in the Rocky Mountains. So, the mountains that I'm used to are huge. Glacier National Park. And so when I came to, say, Lake County in California, where my spouse and I lived for a few years, I saw all these rolling hills, and there were a couple of mountains that were decent sized, but it was really nothing in compared to the mountains that I grew up in. All that to say that they're on top of a mountain. I found it interesting that it was a little bit more of a hill than I assumed, but it's kind of interesting the way that we approach these documents, right? You see the word mount, and I think mountain because I'm from Montana, and expect them to be on the pinnacle of 4,000 foot mountain, when really they're just up on a hill. So the disciples have come to, sorry about that red herring, the disciples have come up to Jesus and said, so when is all of this stuff happening? When is the temple going to be overthrown? And Jesus leads us into this conversation. And this is where many in the modern church get this end times conversation from. Because he's describing to the disciples when he's going to be coming back, essentially. There are a lot of ways to interpret this, and I want to give you some of the standard ones, and just so that you can make up your own mind on this subject. And I want to, in the end, because this is my search, to find human truths that cross our faiths and our political differences, that we can encourage each other with and live by together and share those virtues. That's what I'm looking for. And there's one in particular that I want to wrap up with that I think is an excellent point that Jesus makes and something that we have to watch out for as human beings. So the disciples have asked Jesus, when's this all going to happen? And Jesus responds with this text. So the first thing he says is, don't be misled, because there's going to be many coming who are claiming to be the Messiah and King of Israel, but they're going to be essentially false people. And as he puts it, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. This has been something that has happened since even the time of Jesus. At the time of Jesus, in fact, there were people also claiming to be the Messiah, the Christ. And again, this word Christ, which is where we get Jesus Christ, the name, it isn't his last name like Jesus W. Christ. It is his moniker, his title, because Christ means anointed one or king in their culture. So essentially when you say Jesus Christ, you're saying Jesus the King is what that translates to and what it really means. So when Jesus is saying this, he's saying, look, there are going to be people who are going to claim to be the king. Watch out and don't be misled. I really want to talk about this particular issue because this one is spot on for our human reality, and watching out for people who will mislead us and deceive us into thinking that they should be our king or our political figure. In those of us who live in democracies, we get to vote for those who are in leadership. And so it's the same kind of thing, but in a little different context for us. So Jesus says a couple of other items that I want to walk through. So the first one is there's going to be wars and rumors of wars. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, earthquakes, famine. So there's all this stuff that he's naming. And the most important part of that particular passage is the fact that he says this is just the beginning of it. In other words, all this stuff is going to transpire all the time. We should just expect it. It's part of our regular human life, that there are going to be wars, there are going to be people who threaten war, that we're going to see earthquakes, that we're going to see famines, and we have seen a myriad of those. Even today, right now, we have rumors of wars, and we have wars going on across our globe still. That's something that is slightly upset. Well, not slightly, it is very upsetting to me. In a world where we have come to a place as humans where the culmination, the entirety of human knowledge is right in our fingertips. This is just my particular phone. And the culmination of human knowledge exists right here in this little contraption. I can read all the history. I can see all the truth of our human nature. I can understand all the things that we've learned before. And with all of that, being able to look at cultures, open Google Earth, and to be able to check out the license plate of a car in Zimbabwe, it's a different world. And you would think that we might have grown as a species to be able to see war does not work, that controlling people doesn't work. But unfortunately, we haven't. And unfortunately, we may have to suffer through some of that to relearn some of these lessons. The challenge is every generation of humans begins with absolutely no idea what they're there for. We begin with a clean slate, and so that's the challenge for us. But anyway, there's all of these things that will continue to come along for us. And in the end, Jesus' point in this is that this is the beginning of birth pangs. And then he's going to, tomorrow we're going to see him talking about what's going to happen after that. And then after that, he's going to go into this conversation about this abomination that causes desolation, which is going to be an exciting conversation for me because that phrase is very misunderstood, misquoted, and really needs to be placed in context. So I want to bring you into my own culture. As we kind of get to the close of this, I want to spend some time talking about the whole false Christ thing. And really this can be translated as antichrist or Christ that are not really the kings but are presenting themselves as such. One of the things that was very frustrating to me in my own particular religious background is that I was introduced to the idea of the Antichrist, or this centralized figure of an individual who will, lead the war against the church. And many people end up painting this character as this devil-looking figure, and this figure that claims to hate God and claims to hate Jesus. It's this complete enemy against the church. That's not really what this word means here. This word means the person who places himself instead of the king. In other words, they're coming forward and saying, I am king, and I have a message, or I am the one who should be in charge. We're going to get those all the time. In particular, recently, as in like the last few years, I had to make a stand against my own religious background and community because a specific leader in our political setting claimed or made or highlighted and praised a statement that claimed they were the king of Israel. That language is exactly what Jesus is talking about here. It literally is exactly that. Somebody claiming to be the king of Israel. So it was difficult for me to suggest that any person could just claim that and just be believed or just to be ignored. That kind of statement is one that doesn't reflect the humility that we should associate with our leadership, but in fact includes this idea of arrogance. And I want to talk about just a couple of these things. How in the world do we spot those who are false versus those who aren't? Because as human beings, and this is where the human part comes in, this isn't just a Christian thing. It's not a Muslim thing. It's not a Jewish thing or a Buddhist thing. This is a human issue. How do we address the people who come to us and claim that they should be king or that they have the answers? Because many of them will claim to be our leaders and to believe the same thing that we do. They will put forth information that will make us think that they are on our side, when in really their agenda is something completely different. This is exactly what Jesus was wrestling against in the account that we have. And just this last week, we had to deal with. The religious leaders of his day were saying that they were one thing, but really, and said that they were looking out for God, that they were looking out for the suffering and for the poor, but really they could care less. They were interested in living a life of luxury, of being important, of being seen by others as pure and righteous, and really did absolutely nothing for those who were suffering in society. How do we discern that today? And we've talked about this a little bit already, but I want to bring back another teaching that we learned earlier on by Jesus that I think really applies here. And back when we talked about it, we saw as a human lesson is vital when we're looking at leadership. And this is really probably the most important thing that I could say in this particular study. When we are looking at leadership, trying to decide whether they are being honest with us or not, we don't always have the ability to prove it at the time. But what we can use, what we can put together to decide and judge are the fruits. The fruits. What are the consequences of their leadership? If their leadership creates peacemaking, if their leadership creates humility, if their leadership creates mercy, compassion, long-suffering, patience, then that is a good leader and was honest with us about the fact that they stand for good human virtues. And for those who are in the Christian worldview, stand for teachings that Jesus in particular stood for. But if this individual who's in leadership, in fact, creates division, has anger and resentment to people, does not love their enemy, is arrogant about themselves and brags about themselves, is not long-suffering but is overzealous in attacking those who they disagree with. These are the individuals, because of these fruits, these consequences that we see, we can finally say they're not being honest with us. They don't actually believe in the virtues that we do as either Christians or just as human beings. I want to leave on that message, especially this is an election year in the United States. This is a difficult election year because there's a lot of messages being thrown at us. And I'm going to give you the words of Jesus as a way to help you maybe think about who to vote for. Not because I'm trying to make you a Christian, but because he has some good things to say. And this particular teaching, I think as a human being, is incredibly helpful. Let's just look at the fruits. Of those people asking to be in leadership, what has their leadership created? What have the results been for everybody? And in the end, whoever created peace, whoever created humility and respect, whoever created patience and kindness and compassion for those who are poor and suffering, those are those who are living according to virtues and will uphold virtues that are good for us as humans. Because, and last, in closing, when we don't encourage and have leadership who believe in those virtues, we have violence, we have revolts, we have anger and resentment, because people can only suffer for so long. They can only be poor and be miserable in their lives for so long. People can only stand arrogance and slander and bullying and anger for so long before They stepped beyond their words and moved to protesting with their hands and violence. I want to thank you for being a part of this particular Bible study today. I know it's been a bit of a heavy conversation. It's kind of a heavy time right now for those of us in the U.S. trying to make a decision about who we should believe and who we should follow as leadership. And in the world, really, we're all having to make difficult decisions about people because the information we're given, who knows if it is accurate. We can look at their fruits and we can look at their actions to determine whether they are good for us or whether they are not. If you have thoughts, questions, and I'm sure you probably do on these issues, because this is a highly contentious political environment, but also religiously, the end times is something of a great controversy in the church. I would welcome your thoughts and your comments and reflections. You're the only person who has the ability to see things from your perspective. And so we need that. And I would encourage you to do that. I would love it if you would like our Facebook page, subscribe to the YouTube channel. There's a little button right down there you can click. Would love that so we can stay in contact with one another. It's got some exciting things coming up. So until tomorrow, when we meet again, live at noon, and we get to talk more about Jesus' thoughts in the end times, I want you to know that I love you. I truly hope that you choose to love yourself. It is the only love that we have any control over in this world. And now I invite you to join me as we go about the rest of our day, loving those around us the same way. Thank you.